The shotgun blast echoed through Piper Montgomery's cabin, splintering the wooden frame of her bedroom window and sending a shower of glass across her handmade quilt. She'd been expecting them. The Holloway gang never did take kindly to rejection, especially when that rejection came from a woman who owned the last parcel of land standing between them and complete control of Willow Creek's water supply. Piper dropped to the floor, her heart pounding against her ribs as she crawled toward the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. The pendant around her neck, her mother's last gift before consumption, took her swung like a pendulum, counting down her remaining seconds of safety. Another shot rang out, followed by jeering male voices and the sound of boots on her porch steps. "Come on out, Miss Montgomery," called a gruff voice she recognized as belonging to Silas Holloway. "My offer still stands: your land or your life." With trembling fingers, Piper retrieved her father's Colt revolver from the chest. 4 years since he'd been murdered for this very same land, and here she was, fighting the same battle. Her hands steadied as she checked the chamber. 6 bullets, 6 chances. "I'd rather die than sell to you," she shouted back, positioning herself against the wall beside her door. "And I'll take a few of you with me." The spring of 1876 had brought little but hardship to Colorado territory, and Piper Montgomery had learned the hard way that love, like rain in the desert, was just a cruel mirage. Her fiancé, Charles, had abandoned her the moment her father was murdered, revealing that his affections extended only as far as her potential inheritance. Now, at 24, she had built walls around her heart, as solid as the mountains framing her valley. The front door crashed open with a splintering of wood. Piper closed her eyes for just a moment, steadying her breathing as her father had taught her. 4 men at least, judging by the heavy footfalls spreading through her home. She could hear them ransacking her small living area, knocking over the furniture she'd carefully crafted with her own hands. "Check the bedroom," Silas commanded. Piper raised her revolver just as her bedroom door swung open. She didn't hesitate, squeezing the trigger and watching the surprised face of one of Holloway's men crumple as he clutched his shoulder, howling in pain. "She shot me. The bitch shot me." Chaos erupted as Piper darted past the wounded man and into the main room, where she came face to face with Silas Holloway himself, a man whose graying mustache and expensive suit belied the cruelty in his eyes. "There she is," he sneered, raising his own pistol. "Last chance, Miss Montgomery." The sound of galloping hooves outside drew everyone's attention. Through the broken front door, Piper glimpsed a rider approaching at breakneck speed, dust billowing behind him like a storm cloud. "We've got company," shouted one of Holloway's men, turning toward the door with his weapon raised. The rider didn't slow. Instead, he leaped from his horse directly through the open doorway, his momentum carrying him into the gunmen and sending them both crashing to the floor. The newcomer recovered first, delivering a swift punch that left Holloway's man unconscious. Silas swung his gun toward the intruder, but the stranger was faster, drawing his own weapon in a fluid motion that spoke of years of practice. Their standoff lasted only seconds before 2 more shots echoed in the small cabin. Piper had taken advantage of the distraction to fire at Holloway's remaining men, catching one in the leg and sending the other diving for cover. "I suggest you collect your men and leave," the stranger said, his voice deep and steady as he kept his gun trained on Silas. The ladies made her position clear. Silas Holloway's face contorted with rage, but he was no fool. Outnumbered and outgunned, he slowly lowered his weapon. "This isn't over," he spat, his gaze shifting between Piper and her unexpected savior. "Not by a long shot." "It is for today," the stranger replied. His hat cast shadows across his face, but Piper could see the determined set of his jaw, the steady hand that held his revolver with practiced ease. Holloway and his men retreated, dragging their wounded companions. Only when the sound of their horses had faded into the distance did Piper allow herself to lower her gun, her knees suddenly weak with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. "Thank you," she managed, though the words felt insufficient. "They would have killed me." The stranger holstered his weapon and turned to face her fully, removing his hat to reveal sun-bronzed skin, eyes the color of a summer sky and hair the rich brown of fertile soil. He couldn't have been more than 30, with a face that might have been considered handsome if not for the scar that ran along his right cheekbone and the weariness that seemed etched into his features. Thomas Blackwood, he introduced himself with a slight nod. Sheriff sent me. Said the Holloways were making trouble again. Piper raised an eyebrow. Sheriff Harrison sent you. Last I checked, he was firmly in Holloway's pocket. A hint of a smile tugged at Thomas's lips. Sheriff Harrison retired last month. Quite suddenly, after some evidence of his involvement in certain unsavory activities came to light. He glanced around at her damaged home. New sheriff's a friend of mine from the war. Asked me to keep an eye on the situation here while he cleans up the town. Piper moved to right an overturned chair, needing something to do with her hands. Well, Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate the assistance, but I've been handling the Holloways on my own for 4 years now. I don't need a protector. Clearly, Thomas replied, gesturing to her still clutched revolver. But even the best shot can be overwhelmed by numbers, and Holloway's recruited more men recently. How would you know that? Piper asked, suddenly suspicious. Because I've been tracking them for the past 3 weeks. He moved to the broken window, scanning the landscape outside with practiced vigilance. They've been buying up land all across the territory, damming streams, charging farmers for water access. Piper's jaw tightened. That's why they want my land. The creek that runs through it feeds half the farms in the valley. Thomas nodded. Which is why you're not safe here alone. They'll be back with more men next time. I'm not leaving, Piper stated firmly. This land is all I have left of my father. He died protecting it. Thomas turned back to her, his expression softening slightly. I'm not suggesting you leave. I'm suggesting you accept some help. Piper studied him, trying to discern his motivations. She'd learned the hard way that men rarely offered assistance without expecting something in return. Charles had pretended to love her while eyeing her inheritance. The banker in town had offered favorable terms on a loan in exchange for private meetings. Even the previous sheriff had suggested he could protect her for a price. What exactly are you offering, Mr. Blackwood? And what do you want in return? Something flashed in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or respect for her directness. I'm offering to help you protect what's yours, in return. He paused, then shrugged. In return, I get to complete the job I was hired to do. Gather enough evidence to put Silas Holloway behind bars where he belongs. Piper considered this. It sounded reasonable enough, but experience had taught her that reason and truth were often strangers to one another, especially when it came to men making promises. I'll consider it, she said finally. But I'll need to fix this window before nightfall, and I don't have time to stand around debating. Thomas nodded, setting his hat back on his head. I'll help with the repairs. I've got some tools on my horse. As he stepped outside to retrieve his supplies, Piper allowed herself a moment to breathe. The attack had left her shaken, more than she cared to admit. And while Thomas Blackwood seemed genuine enough, she'd been fooled before by earnest eyes and ready assistance. Love, her father used to say, was finding someone who stood beside you in the storm, not just during the sunshine. But her experience with Charles had taught her that love was more often a convenient lie, a mask worn by those who wanted something from you. And what Thomas Blackwood might want beyond his stated mission remained to be seen. For now, though, she needed that broken window fixed. She could sort out trust and intentions later. Thomas returned with a toolbox and a bundle of supplies. Without a word, he began measuring the window frame, his movements efficient and practiced. You've done this before, Piper observed, handing him a nail when he reached for one. Spent some time as a carpenter after the war, he replied without looking up from his work. Before I took up tracking. And what were you before the war, Mr. Blackwood? His hands paused momentarily. A different man, he said quietly, then resumed his work. Piper recognized the response for what it was, a door firmly closed on a past he had no intention of discussing. She respected that. She had her own closed doors, after all. They worked together in companionable silence for a time, Piper holding boards in place while Thomas secured them. It would be a temporary fix until proper glass could be obtained from town, but it would keep out the night air and any unwelcome visitors. You handle a gun well, Thomas commented as they finished securing the last board. Your father teach you, Piper nodded. He believed a woman should be able to protect herself. She ran her fingers along the worn grip of her revolver. He taught me how to shoot, how to ride, how to run the ranch, said I shouldn't have to depend on anyone else. Smart man. He was, Piper agreed, a familiar ache settling in her chest, until Holloway had him killed for refusing to sell. Thomas's gaze sharpened. You have proof of that. Nothing that would stand up in court, but everyone knows. Holloway wanted the land. My father refused, and 3 days later he was found shot in the back while checking fence lines. Piper's voice remained steady, though the memory still burned like a fresh wound. The previous sheriff called it a robbery gone wrong, even though nothing was taken. Thomas nodded slowly. That fits with other stories I've heard about Holloway. He's careful to keep his hands clean while his men do the dirty work. Which is why I don't understand what evidence you hope to gather, Piper said. Men like Holloway don't make mistakes. Every man makes mistakes, Miss Montgomery, Thomas replied, his voice taking on a harder edge. Especially when they get desperate. And right now, Holloway is getting desperate for your land. A thought occurred to Piper then, one that sent a chill down her spine despite the warm spring day. You're using me as bait, she said flatly. Thomas had the decency to look uncomfortable. Not intentionally, but your situation presents an opportunity. Holloway's been careful elsewhere, but he's becoming reckless about your property. Because I'm a woman alone, Piper concluded bitterly. An easy target. No, Thomas corrected her, surprising her with the firmness in his voice. Because your land is the key to controlling the entire valley's water, and because you've defied him longer than anyone else has managed to. Something in his tone respect, perhaps softened Piper's indignation slightly. Still, the idea that she was being used as part of some larger plan didn't sit well with her. I should have been informed of this strategy before you implemented it, she said. My life is at stake. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, leaving a streak of sawdust. You're right, he admitted, but I only just arrived in the area. I was on my way to introduce myself properly when I heard the gunshots. Piper studied him, trying to determine if he was telling the truth. His steady gaze didn't waver, and there was an openness to his expression that seemed genuine. If I agree to work with you, she said slowly, I need to know everything, no more surprises, and I make the final decisions about my land and my safety. Thomas nodded. Agreed, partners then. He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Piper took it. His grip was firm but not crushing, his calloused palm speaking of years of hard work. Partners, she agreed, for now. As the sun began to set, painting the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, Thomas insisted on checking the perimeter of her property before departing. I'll be back at first light, he told her as he mounted his horse, a magnificent black stallion that seemed almost as watchful as its rider. Keep your doors barricaded and that revolver close. Piper nodded, standing in her doorway with her arms crossed. I've survived 4 years of Holloway's threats, Mr. Blackwood. I'll survive the night. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I don't doubt it, Miss Montgomery. He tipped his hat to her. Sleep well. As she watched him ride away, Piper couldn't help but wonder if she'd made a mistake in trusting this stranger. This Thomas Blackwood with his careful words and watchful eyes. But the alternative facing Holloway's escalating threats alone was becoming increasingly dangerous. Trust, like love, was a luxury she hadn't been able to afford for a long time. But sometimes, survival required taking risks. And Thomas Blackwood, whatever his true motives might be, was a risk she was tentatively willing to take. True to his word, Thomas returned at dawn the next day, bringing with him supplies to properly repair her window and provisions that would last her several days. Piper was surprised to find him already at work when she emerged from her bedroom, having entered so quietly she hadn't heard him. You could have knocked, she chided, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. I did, Thomas replied without pausing in his work. Then I heard movement around the back of the house and thought it best to investigate. Piper frowned. What did you find? Just a deer, but I noticed your back door lock is broken. He nodded toward a new piece of hardware on her table. Brought a replacement. Piper's irritation at his presumption was tempered by the practicality of his actions. "Thank you," she said, moving to stoke the fire in her small stove. "Would you like some coffee, please?" They settled into a surprising rhythm over the next few hours, repairing windows and doors, reinforcing weak points in the cabin's structure. Thomas worked efficiently, speaking little but answering Piper's occasional questions about his plans for capturing evidence against Holloway. "The new sheriff is building a case," he explained as they sat on her porch for a brief rest, drinking coffee that Piper had to admit was better than her own. Thomas had brought the beans from town. "Tax evasion, land fraud, intimidation. But to prove murder, we need either a witness willing to testify or irrefutable evidence. And you think Holloway will provide that by coming after me again?" Piper concluded. Thomas nodded. "I think he's getting desperate. The railroad's planning a route through the territory, and whoever controls the water rights stands to make a fortune." "My father knew that," Piper said softly. "He used to say that in the West, land without water is just dirt. He had plans to ensure fair access for all the farmers in the valley." "A man of principle," Thomas observed. "Yes." Piper studied him over the rim of her cup. "What about you, Mr. Blackwood? Are you a man of principle or just a man doing a job?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "There was a time when I might have said just a job," he finally admitted. "But some things change a man's perspective. The war, partly." He set his cup down, his expression unreadable. "Seeing what men like Holloway do to communities like this one that changes you too." Before Piper could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders were making their way up the long path to her cabin, moving at a leisurely pace that suggested they weren't immediately hostile. Thomas stood, his hand moving instinctively to his holster. "Expecting visitors?" Piper shook her head, rising to stand beside him. "No, but that's Harold Miller in the lead. He owns the farm adjacent to mine. The others look like the Dawson brothers from down the valley." Thomas relaxed slightly but remained alert as the riders approached. Harold Miller, a robust man in his 50s with a gray streaked beard, raised his hand in greeting as they drew closer. "Morning, Piper," he called. "Heard there was some trouble out here yesterday." "News travels fast," Piper replied, stepping off her porch to meet them. "Small town," Harold said with a shrug, dismounting from his horse. His curious gaze shifted to Thomas. "Don't believe we've been introduced." "Thomas Blackwood," Thomas said, extending his hand. "Working with the new sheriff." Harold's eyebrows rose. "About time someone did something about Holloway." He turned back to Piper. "That's actually why we're here. Word is Holloway's bringing in more men from Denver. Thought you might want some neighbors keeping an eye out." Piper felt a surge of gratitude. These men had been her father's friends, had helped her through the difficult days after his murder. While they'd offered protection before, she'd always declined, not wanting to put them at risk, but now with Holloway escalating his efforts. "I appreciate that, Harold," she said sincerely. "All of you?" The elder of the Dawson brothers, a lean man with perpetually sunburned features, nodded solemnly. "Your father would have done the same for any of us. Besides, if Holloway gets control of your creek, we all suffer." Thomas stepped forward. "Do you know when these men from Denver are expected to arrive?" "Tomorrow or the next day, from what I heard at the saloon," Harold replied. 6 or 7 of them, all hired guns." Thomas and Piper exchanged a glance. This changed things. A direct confrontation with that many armed men would be suicide. "We need a different approach," Thomas said quietly. Piper nodded, then addressed her neighbors. "Harold, I can't ask you and the others to risk your lives in a gunfight." "Not asking for that," Harold assured her. "But we can take shifts watching the approaches to your property, give warning if Holloway's men are coming. And I've got 4 sons who can help," added the younger Dawson brother. "All good with rifles." Thomas considered this. "That could work," he said. "A show of community support might make Holloway reconsider a direct attack." For the next hour, they mapped out a strategy, determining observation points and signals. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it gave them a chance to prepare rather than simply react to Holloway's next move. As her neighbors departed, promising to spread the word to other farmers in the valley, Piper felt a complex mixture of emotions. Gratitude for their support, certainly, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. These people were risking their safety for her land, for her father's vision of fair water access. "Your father inspired loyalty," Thomas observed, seeming to read her thoughts. "He believed in community," Piper replied. "He used to say that out here, either we all survive together or we all fail separately." Thomas nodded. "Wise man." He glanced at the sun's position. "We should finish the repairs while we have daylight." They worked side by side throughout the afternoon, and Piper found herself studying Thomas when he wasn't looking. There was something in the careful precision of his movements, in the watchful way he surveyed their surroundings, that spoke of more than just a hired lawman. His knowledge of carpentry was extensive, his hands creating tight joins and secure fittings with practiced ease. "Where did you learn to work wood like this?" she asked as he fitted a new hinge to her back door. "My father was a furniture maker in Pennsylvania," Thomas replied, surprising her with this small personal detail. "I apprenticed with him before the war. Why didn't you return to it afterward?" His hands stilled for a moment. "Some skills are easier to pick up again than others," he said quietly. "After what I did during the war, the patience required for fine woodworking escaped me." The admission seemed to cost him something, and Piper didn't press further. She understood what it was to have parts of yourself altered by loss and violence. "My mother was a teacher," she offered instead, sharing a piece of herself in return. "She taught me to read and write, to love books and ideas. After she died, my father would ride for days to bring me new books from Denver." Thomas glanced at her, a small smile softening his features. "What do you like to read?" "History, mostly, some poetry." Piper felt oddly self-conscious under his interested gaze. "My father believed education was important, even perhaps especially for a woman." "Another way he was ahead of his time," Thomas commented. As evening approached, Thomas helped Piper bring in extra firewood and secure the livestock in her small barn. The domesticity of these shared tasks felt strange to Piper, who had grown accustomed to complete independence. Stranger still was how easily they settled into a rhythm together, anticipating each other's movements, passing tools without having to ask. "Will you stay in town tonight?" Piper asked as they finished the evening chores. Thomas shook his head. "I'll camp near your property line, close enough to respond if there's trouble, but far enough not to cause gossip." Piper hadn't considered that aspect. A single woman hosting a man overnight would indeed set tongues wagging in Willow Creek. Not that she particularly cared about town gossip, but she appreciated his consideration. "There's an old hunter's cabin about half a mile east," she suggested. "It's not much, but it has a roof and a fireplace." "That would be preferable to another night under the stars," Thomas admitted. "Thank you." As he prepared to depart, gathering his tools and supplies, an unexpected awkwardness fell between them. They had spent the day working closely together, sharing small confidences, establishing a tentative trust. Now, with night approaching and separation imminent, Piper found herself reluctant to see him go. "I'll check the perimeter before I head to the cabin," Thomas said, adjusting his gun belt. "Make sure everything's secure." "Thank you," Piper replied, "for all of this." Thomas met her gaze, his blue eyes serious. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Montgomery. Holloway's still out there and he's getting desperate." "Piper," she said suddenly. "If we're going to be partners in this, you might as well use my given name." A small smile touched his lips. "Piper," he repeated as if testing the sound of it. "Then I'm Thomas." The simple exchange felt significant somehow, a small door opening between them. Piper watched him mount his horse, the fading light casting long shadows across her yard. "Be careful, Thomas," she called as he turned to ride away. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "Always am," he replied, then added more softly, "Sleep well, Piper." As his figure disappeared into the trees, Piper retreated into her cabin, securing each lock and bar they'd installed throughout the day. The space felt different now, safer, yes, but also somehow marked by Thomas's presence. His precise workmanship was evident in every repair, his consideration in the stocked woodpile and fresh water bucket by the stove. Small kindnesses, Piper reminded herself, didn't equate to genuine care. Charles had brought her flowers and written her poems, all while plotting to secure her inheritance. She would not make the mistake of confusing practical partnership with anything deeper. Still, as she prepared for bed, checking her revolver one last time before placing it within easy reach, Piper couldn't help but feel that something had shifted today. Not just in her circumstances, but within herself. For the first time in 4 years, she had allowed someone to help her, to share her burden. And while caution still counseled her to keep her guard up, a smaller, nearly forgotten part of her whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, Thomas Blackwood might prove worthy of trust. The thought followed her into sleep, where her dreams were surprisingly free of the usual nightmares of her father's death and Charles's betrayal. Instead, she dreamed of steady hands building fences, of blue eyes watchful against distant horizons, of a deep voice saying her name as if it mattered. Dawn arrived with a pale golden light filtering through the newly repaired window. Piper rose early, as was her habit, and set about her morning chores with a strange sense of anticipation. She told herself it was merely the tension of waiting for Holloway's next move, but a more honest part of her acknowledged she was looking forward to Thomas's return. She had just finished feeding her chickens when she spotted him riding toward the cabin, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Something about his posture rigid, alert sent a warning through her. She set down her feed bucket and moved to meet him, one hand instinctively checking that her revolver was secure at her hip. "What's happened?" she asked as soon as he was within earshot. Thomas dismounted in a fluid motion. "Riders passed near the cabin last night. 4 of them, heading toward town, didn't look like Holloway's usual men. The Denver gunmen, possibly." His expression was grim. "I followed them at a distance. They met with Holloway at the saloon late last night." Piper absorbed this information, calculating what it might mean for their tenuous plans. Did Harold and the others see them? They're aware. I spoke with Miller on my way here. Thomas glanced toward the distant road. They're spreading the word, setting up the observation points we discussed. Piper nodded, grateful for the support of her neighbors, but acutely aware that they were farmers, not fighters. Against professional gunmen, they would be at a severe disadvantage. "We need more than just watching and waiting," she said decisively. "We need to know what Holloway's planning." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "What do you suggest?" "I go into town," Piper replied, the idea forming as she spoke. "Holloway doesn't know we're working together. He might let something slip if he thinks I'm considering his offer to buy my land." Thomas's expression darkened. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. It's my land and my life at stake," Piper reminded him firmly. "And I know Holloway. He's arrogant. He'll want to gloat, to explain his grand plans. Or he'll have you shot the moment you're alone," Thomas countered. "Not in the middle of town, in broad daylight. He's too careful for that." They stood facing each other, neither willing to yield. Piper could see the genuine concern in Thomas's eyes, but also a reluctant recognition of the logic in her plan. "At least let me accompany you," he finally said. Piper shook her head. "If Holloway sees us together, he'll be suspicious, but you could follow at a distance, keep watch." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, clearly unhappy with the compromise but seeing the strategic value. "We do it tomorrow," he decided. "Today, we continue preparations here. And you don't go alone. We'll arrange for Mrs. Miller to accompany you, make it look like a normal shopping trip." It was a reasonable precaution, and Piper nodded her agreement. "I'll need to bring eggs and butter to sell anyway. It won't look suspicious." With the plan settled, they turned to the day's tasks. Thomas had brought more supplies from town: ammunition, additional tools, preserves, and coffee. Piper was touched by his thoughtfulness, especially the coffee, which was becoming a luxury she rarely indulged in due to its cost. "The sheriff provided most of it," Thomas explained when she commented on the generosity. "He's invested in keeping you safe and gathering evidence against Holloway." They spent the morning reinforcing the barn and corral, creating defensive positions in case of an attack. Thomas's military experience was evident in the strategic placement of barriers and sight lines, ensuring maximum protection with their limited resources. As they worked, Piper found herself asking more about his past, curious about the events that had shaped this careful, competent man. "Where were you stationed during the war?" she asked as they stacked hay bales to create a bulletproof barrier near the barn door. "Virginia, mostly," Thomas replied, his tone neutral in a way that suggested deliberate control. "Then Georgia toward the end. Union Army," he nodded. "Infantry." "Enlisted in '62, after Antietam. Seemed like the fight might end quickly then. I was wrong." Piper heard what he didn't say, that like so many young men, he'd gone to war expecting glory and found only horror. She'd seen the same haunted look in the eyes of other veterans who'd passed through Willow Creek over the years. "My father wanted to enlist," she offered. "But he had a bad leg from a childhood accident. He supported the Union cause through other means, supplies, information." Thomas glanced at her. That could have been dangerous in a border territory. "It was," Piper acknowledged. "We had neighbors who sympathized with the Confederacy. There were incidents. Yet you stayed." "This land was everything to my father," Piper said simply. "And now it's everything to me." They paused for a midday meal, sharing bread and cheese in the shade of an old oak tree near the house. The day had grown warm, the spring sun gaining strength as it climbed higher. Thomas had removed his coat, working in shirt sleeves that revealed strong forearms marked with old scars, some that looked like battle wounds, others more precise, surgical. Noticing her gaze, Thomas self-consciously rolled his sleeves down. "Shrapnel," he explained briefly. "From Gettysburg." "I'm sorry," Piper said quietly. "Does it still pain you?" A half smile touched his lips. "Only when it rains," he replied, then added more seriously, "The physical wounds heal. It's the others that linger." The admission, simple as it was, felt like a confidence shared, a small trust extended. Piper found herself wanting to offer something in return. "After Charles left my former fiancé, I thought I would die from the shame and heartbreak," she said, surprising herself with the confession. "Not because I loved him so deeply, I realize now, but because his betrayal confirmed my worst fears, that I wasn't enough on my own, that I needed a man to survive out here." Thomas listened without interrupting, his gaze steady on her face. "It took nearly a year before I understood that his leaving was the best thing that could have happened," Piper continued. "It forced me to become stronger, to learn to rely on myself. Now I can't imagine surrendering my independence to anyone, not even for love." Thomas asked, the question gentle but direct. Piper looked away, watching a hawk circle lazily in the distant sky. "Love is a luxury I can't afford," she said finally, "and in my experience, it's usually just a pretty disguise for self-interest." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I used to think similarly," he admitted. "After the war, after seeing the worst that men could do to each other, it seemed safer to keep to myself, to avoid attachments. What changed?" He seemed to consider his answer carefully. "I realized that avoiding pain meant avoiding life entirely. And that seemed like surrendering to the very darkness I'd fought against." His words resonated with something deep inside Piper, a truth she'd been avoiding. Her isolation, while born of necessity, had become a kind of prison, safety purchased at the cost of connection. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Harold Miller and his oldest son were riding toward them at a brisk pace. Thomas was on his feet immediately, hand dropping to his holster. "Something's wrong," he muttered, moving to intercept the riders. Piper followed, a sense of dread building as she recognized the urgency in Harold's posture. "Holloway's men are gathering at the saloon," Harold called as they approached. "At least a dozen of them, including the new ones from Denver. They're drinking heavily and making threats." "Against Piper specifically?" Thomas asked, his voice sharp. Harold nodded grimly. "They're saying they'll burn her out if she won't sell. One of them, a tall fellow with a scar across his throat, was boasting that they'd handle it tonight." Piper felt a cold determination replace her fear. "Then we'll be ready for them." Thomas turned to her, his expression severe. "This changes our plans. You need to leave, Piper, now. Go stay with the Millers until this is resolved." "No," Piper said firmly. "I'm not abandoning my home. My father died defending this land. I won't dishonor his memory by running away." "It's not about honor," Thomas argued, frustration evident in his voice. It's about survival. These men are killers, Piper, professional gunmen who won't hesitate to shoot a woman. All the more reason I won't cower and hide, Piper insisted. Besides, this might be our best chance to catch Holloway in the act to get the evidence you need. Thomas looked like he wanted to continue arguing, but Harold interrupted. She's right about one thing. If we're ever going to stop Holloway, we need proof of his crimes. This could be our opportunity. A tense silence fell as Thomas visibly struggled with the decision. Finally, he gave a curt nod. We fortify the house, he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't open to debate. And you, he added, looking directly at Piper, stay inside no matter what happens. It wasn't ideal, but Piper recognized the compromise for what it was. Agreed. The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity as they prepared for the coming attack. Harold rode to gather more of their neighbors, while his son was dispatched to alert the new sheriff. Thomas and Piper worked methodically to create defensive positions around the cabin, moving valuable livestock to a distant pasture and stockpiling water in case the attackers targeted the well. By late afternoon, their small force had assembled 8 farmers and ranchers positioned strategically around the property, armed with hunting rifles and determination. Thomas moved among them, giving instructions, checking positions, his military experience evident in the precision of his planning. As dusk approached, Thomas rejoined Piper in the cabin, where she was loading spare ammunition and checking her revolver one final time. Everything's set, he told her, his voice tight with tension. If they come, we're as ready as we can be. Piper nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. The reality of what they were facing, armed men who killed for money, was settling over her like a heavy cloak. Thomas must have sensed her anxiety, for his expression softened. It's not too late to reconsider, he said quietly. You could still go to the Millers. Piper shook her head. This ends tonight one way or another. A look passed between them, understanding, respect, and something else Piper wasn't ready to name. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm, a brief contact that somehow conveyed more than words could. Thank you, she said simply, for standing with me. Thomas covered her hand with his own for just a moment. Always, he replied, the word carrying a weight that seemed to fill the space between them. The moment was broken by a shout from outside one of their lookouts, signaling that riders were approaching. Thomas moved to the window, carefully peering around the edge of the curtain. At least 10 men, he reported, his voice becoming clipped and professional. Holloway's with them, staying toward the back. Piper joined him at the window, her heart pounding but her hands steady. The approaching riders were visible now in the fading light, a menacing line spread across her property. In their center, she could make out Silas Holloway's distinctive figure, his gray hair catching the last rays of the setting sun. Remember the plan, Thomas said, moving toward the door. Stay inside, away from the windows. If they breach the cabin, use the trapdoor to the root cellar we prepared. Piper wanted to argue, to insist on fighting alongside him, but she recognized the strategic value of the plan they'd developed. Her role was to remain the apparent target, while Thomas and the others caught Holloway in the act of orchestrating violence. Be careful, she said instead. Thomas paused at the door, looking back at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. When this is over, he said, his voice low and certain, we need to talk. Before Piper could respond, he was gone, slipping outside to take his position among the defenders. She moved to her designated spot beside the fireplace, where a small gap in the logs provided a view of the yard while offering protection from gunfire. The riders had stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. In the deepening twilight, Piper could see them conferring, gesturing toward the darkened house. Then Holloway's voice rang out, carried clearly on the evening air. Miss Montgomery, I know you're in there. I've come to make you one final offer for your land. Piper remained silent as they had planned. Let Holloway reveal his intentions fully, give him rope to hang himself with. No answer. That's unfortunate. Holloway's voice took on a harder edge. I've been patient, Miss Montgomery, more patient than most men would be with a stubborn woman. But my patience has limits. One of the riders beside him, a tall man with a distinctive scar across his throat, matching Harold's description, leaned over to say something. Holloway nodded. "You have 5 minutes to come out and discuss terms," Holloway called. "After that, my associates will have to persuade you by other means." The threat hung in the air, explicit enough to constitute evidence of intimidation. Piper glanced toward the tree line where she knew Thomas and several of the farmers were positioned. In the gathering darkness, she couldn't see them, but she took comfort in knowing they were there, witnesses to Holloway's crimes. 5 tense minutes passed. Piper could see the men growing restless, shifting in their saddles, hands moving to weapons. Then Holloway raised his arm, a clear signal to his men. "Burn her out," he ordered, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. Several riders dismounted, retrieving objects from their saddlebags that Piper recognized with horror as oil-soaked torches. They lit them, the sudden flare of flame illuminating their hard faces and glinting off drawn weapons. Just as they started toward the cabin, a shot rang out from the tree line. One of the torch-bearing men cried out, dropping his flaming brand as he clutched his shoulder. "That's far enough, Holloway," Thomas's voice rang out, authoritative and clear. "You and your men are surrounded. Drop your weapons." Chaos erupted as Holloway's men scrambled for cover, drawing guns and returning fire toward the trees. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunshots and shouted orders. Piper kept her position, watching through the viewing gap as the battle unfolded across her yard. She could see Thomas now, moving from one position to another, coordinating the farmers' defense with military precision. Their ambush had been well planned. Holloway's men were caught in the open, while the defenders had solid cover among the trees and outbuildings. For several minutes, the gunfight continued, neither side gaining a clear advantage. Then Piper noticed movement near the barn. 3 of Holloway's men were circling around, attempting to flank Thomas's position. Without hesitation, Piper moved to the back window. She couldn't alert Thomas without revealing his position to the attackers, but she could act herself. Taking careful aim with her father's revolver, she fired at the nearest of the flanking men. Her shot went wide, but it accomplished her goal, alerting Thomas to the threat. He spun toward the sound, spotted the flanking maneuver, and redirected 2 of the farmers to intercept. But Piper's intervention had consequences. One of Holloway's men had spotted her at the window and shouted a warning to his companions. Suddenly, a barrage of gunfire was directed at the cabin, bullets splintering wood and shattering the newly repaired windows. Piper dropped to the floor, crawling toward her predetermined shelter behind the stone fireplace. As she moved, a stray bullet caught the oil lamp on the table, sending it crashing to the floor in a spray of burning fuel. Flames leapt up immediately, catching on the rug and spreading toward the curtains. Smoke began to fill the cabin, thick and choking. Piper knew she had only moments before the fire blocked her escape. Outside, the gunfight continued, but with a new urgency as the defenders saw the cabin beginning to burn. Piper heard Thomas shouting her name, the desperation in his voice cutting through the chaos of battle. She had to get out. The root cellar would be a death trap now, with fire above. The front door was too exposed to Holloway's men, which left only the back door or windows. Staying low to avoid the thickening smoke, Piper made her way to the back of the cabin. The fire was spreading rapidly, consuming the dry wood of the walls and furniture with frightening speed. Heat pressed against her like a physical force as she reached the back door. She hesitated, knowing that stepping outside would expose her to potential gunfire. But staying meant certain death. Taking a deep breath of what little clean air remained near the floor, Piper unbolted the door and slipped outside. The night air felt shockingly cool after the inferno of the cabin. Piper pressed herself against the outer wall, trying to orient herself amid the continuing sounds of battle. She could see figures moving in the yard, illuminated now by the fire consuming her home. "Piper," Thomas's voice called from somewhere to her right. "Here," she shouted back, then ducked as bullets splintered the wood near her head. She returned fire, her shot hitting one of Holloway's men in the leg and sending him sprawling. Then Thomas was beside her, his face streaked with soot, and his expression a mixture of relief and fury. "You were supposed to stay away from the windows," he growled, pulling her toward the cover of a large oak tree. "They were flanking you," Piper retorted, wincing as a splinter in her arm made itself known. "You're welcome, by the way." A reluctant smile touched his lips, there and gone in an instant. "Can you make it to the tree line?" he asked, gesturing toward the dense stand of pines about 30 yards away. Piper nodded. "Cover me." Thomas raised his rifle. "On my mark, 3, 2, 1, go." Piper sprinted across the open ground, expecting at any moment to feel the impact of a bullet. But Thomas's covering fire was effective, forcing Holloway's men to keep their heads down. She reached the trees and dove behind a thick trunk, breathing hard but unharmed. Thomas followed moments later, dropping down beside her with a grunt of pain. In the firelight, Piper could see blood staining his left sleeve. "You're hit," she said, reaching for him with instinctive concern. "Just a graze," he assured her, though his face was tight with pain. "We need to circle around to where Harold and the others are positioned. The sheriff should be arriving soon with reinforcements." A new volley of gunfire erupted from the direction of the road, but this time it was directed at Holloway's men. Shouts of "Sheriff's Department" cut through the night. "Speak of the devil," Thomas said with grim satisfaction. The arrival of the sheriff and his deputies turned the tide quickly. Caught between two forces, Holloway's men began to surrender, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. Thomas and Piper emerged cautiously from the trees, making their way toward the sheriff, a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard who greeted Thomas with a quick clasp of hands. "Looks like we got here just in time," the sheriff observed, eyeing the burning cabin. "Sorry about your home, Miss Montgomery." Piper barely heard him. Her attention was fixed on the figure of Silas Holloway, who was being led toward them in handcuffs, his usual arrogance replaced by cold fury. "You've made a serious mistake, Sheriff," Holloway was saying. "I was merely trying to negotiate a business transaction when these people opened fire on me and my associates." "That's not how the 12 witnesses I've got see it," the sheriff replied mildly. "They all heard you give the order to burn Miss Montgomery out if she wouldn't sell." Holloway's face contorted with rage. His gaze fell on Piper, and the hatred in his eyes made her take an involuntary step back. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "All of you." "I have friends in Denver. In Washington, save it for the judge," Thomas interrupted, stepping forward to place himself between Piper and Holloway. "You'll have plenty of time to list your important connections while you're waiting to hang for murder." Holloway's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty replacing the rage. "Murder? What nonsense is this?" "The murder of James Montgomery," the sheriff explained, "among others. Turns out one of your Denver gunmen, the one currently bleeding from a shoulder wound, has quite a lot to say about your past operations, especially when faced with the prospect of hanging." Piper felt a wave of emotions so intense she swayed on her feet, relief, vindication, and a grief so fresh it might have happened yesterday. Thomas's hand found hers, steadying her with a gentle pressure. "Take him away," the sheriff ordered, and his deputies led Holloway toward a waiting wagon, his protests fading into the night. As the adrenaline of the confrontation ebbed, Piper became acutely aware of her surroundings, her cabin, her home of 24 years, reduced to a blazing skeleton against the night sky. The barn and outbuildings had been spared, but the house itself was beyond saving. "I'm sorry about your home," Thomas said quietly, following her gaze. Piper took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It's just wood and nails," she said, surprised to find she meant it. "The land remains. I can rebuild." Thomas's hand tightened around hers. "We can rebuild," he corrected gently. Piper looked up at him, searching his face in the firelight. The intensity she found there stole her breath. Determination, certainly, but also something deeper, something that made her heart quicken despite her best intentions. "Thomas," she began, but was interrupted by Harold Miller approaching with a blanket which he draped around her shoulders. "You'll stay with us tonight," Harold said firmly. "Both of you. Martha's already preparing rooms." The practical matters of the aftermath consumed the next few hours, treating the wounded, thankfully, none seriously, securing the prisoners, salvaging what could be saved from the cabin's periphery. Through it all, Thomas remained at Piper's side, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. It was nearly dawn by the time they reached the Miller farm, exhaustion weighing on them like physical burdens. Martha Miller, a kind-faced woman with capable hands, fussed over Piper's minor injuries and Thomas's grazed arm, insisting on proper washing and bandaging before allowing either of them to rest. "You'll stay as long as needed," Martha declared as she showed Piper to a small but comfortable bedroom. "And don't worry about your livestock, Harold, and the boys will look after them." Left alone, Piper sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the night replaying in her mind. Holloway was captured, her father's murder would finally see justice, her land was secure yet her home was gone, and with it, all the physical connections to her parents. Her mother's books, her father's tools, the quilt her grandmother had made all consumed by flames. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Thomas stood in the hallway, his hair damp from washing and his injured arm neatly bandaged. "I wanted to check on you before turning in," he said. "How are you holding up?" Piper managed a tired smile. "I'm alive. My land is safe." "Holloway will face justice. I should be celebrating. But you're mourning what was lost," Thomas finished for her. Understanding in his eyes, Piper nodded, unexpected tears threatening. "It's foolish to weep over things. It's human to weep over memories," Thomas corrected gently. The things themselves were just vessels for what matters. His perception startled her, cutting through her defenses with simple truth. A tear escaped despite her best efforts, tracing a path down her cheek. Without hesitation, Thomas stepped forward and gently brushed it away with his thumb, his touch like a whisper against her skin. "You're the strongest person I've ever met, Piper Montgomery," he said softly, "and there's no shame in feeling loss, even in victory." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, a possibility opening like the first bloom of spring after a harsh winter. Piper found herself leaning slightly into his touch, drawn by a force she'd denied for so long she'd almost forgotten its existence. Thomas's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in the blue depths. Piper's breath caught, her body answering before her mind could raise its practiced defenses. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Thomas leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. And to her own surprise, Piper found herself answering, her hand rising to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers for a brief moment. "We should both get some rest," he said, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Piper nodded, unable to find words for the tumult of feelings cascading through her. Thomas stepped back, his hand lingering on hers for a moment before he released it. "Good night, Piper," he said softly. "Good night, Thomas," she replied, watching as he turned and made his way down the hall to his own room. When the door closed behind him, Piper pressed her fingers to her lips, still feeling the gentle pressure of his kiss. For 4 years, she had convinced herself that love was a luxury she could not afford, a lie wrapped in pretty promises. Now, standing in the aftermath of destruction and renewal, she wondered if perhaps she had been the one telling lies to herself. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams not of fire and loss, but of rebuilding, of new beginnings, of steady hands and eyes blue as the summer sky. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Piper, with Thomas and the community's help, began the process of rebuilding her home. The sheriff completed his investigation, gathering enough evidence to ensure Holloway and several of his men would face trial for multiple crimes, including the murder of James Montgomery. Thomas stayed, his intended temporary assignment extending as he helped with the rebuilding efforts. Each day they worked side by side, falling into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Each evening they sat together on the Miller's porch, planning the next day's work and talking about their pasts, their fears, their hopes. Piper learned about Thomas's Pennsylvania childhood, his difficult relationship with his father, his traumatic experiences during the war that had left him wandering for years afterward, taking odd jobs and avoiding attachments. In turn, she shared stories of her parents, of growing up as an only daughter expected to run a ranch, of Charles's betrayal and her subsequent vow of independence. In these conversations, something grew between them, a trust, a connection that went deeper than physical attraction or circumstantial alliance. Piper found herself looking forward to these evening talks more than she would have thought possible, her heart quickening when Thomas smiled in that particular way he had only for her. Yet she remained cautious, wary of surrendering the independence she had fought so hard to maintain. And Thomas, sensing this, never pushed, content to let whatever was developing between them unfold at its own pace. 10 days after the fire, the frame of Piper's new cabin was erected, a community effort that brought together farmers and ranchers from across the valley. Standing before it at sunset, Piper felt a surge of gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "Your father would be proud," Thomas said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "Not just of the rebuilding, but of how you've united the community." Piper shook her head. "It wasn't me. It was Holloway's threats that brought everyone together." "Don't underestimate your part in this," Thomas insisted. "These people respect you, Piper. They've seen your courage, your determination to protect what matters." Before she could respond, Harold Miller approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "Frame's solid," he announced with satisfaction. "We'll start on the roof tomorrow. Should have you under your own roof again within the week." "I can't thank you enough, Harold," Piper said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of you, I couldn't have done this alone." Harold's weathered face creased in a smile. "That's what neighbors are for, Piper. Your father understood that better than most." He glanced between her and Thomas, his expression knowing. "Well, I'd best get home to Martha. See you both in the morning." As Harold departed, joined by the other workers heading home for the evening, Piper and Thomas were left alone before the skeleton of her new home. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, painting the fresh-cut timber in hues of gold and amber. "It's going to be a fine house," Thomas observed. "Stronger than the old one." Piper nodded, her thoughts turning to the future that stretched before her, a future that just weeks ago had seemed so precarious. Now, with Holloway facing justice and her land secure, possibilities opened like new paths through familiar territory. "Will you stay?" she asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could consider its implications. "After the rebuilding is finished, I mean." Thomas turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Is that what you want?" Piper hesitated, old fears battling with new hopes. "I've been independent for so long," she said carefully. "I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else." "Independence and connection aren't mutually exclusive, Piper," Thomas said gently. "You can stand on your own and still choose to walk alongside someone." His words resonated with something deep within her, a truth she had been approaching slowly, cautiously, over these past days. "What about you?" she asked. "You've been wandering for years. Are you ready to stay in one place?" Thomas's gaze moved from her face to the half-built cabin, then to the land spreading around them, golden in the sunset light. "I've been looking for something without knowing what it was," he said quietly, "until I found you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. No flowery promises, no grand gestures, just truth, offered without expectation. Piper took a step toward him, closing the distance between them. "I'm not easy to love," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm stubborn and too independent for most men's taste." A smile touched Thomas's lips. "I noticed," he said dryly. Then, more seriously, "I don't want to change you, Piper. I admire your strength, your independence. I just want the chance to stand beside you to build something together." His honesty disarmed her final defenses. For years, she had believed love was a pretty lie, a trap designed to take away her hard-won freedom. But standing here, facing this man who had risked his life for her land, who had worked alongside her without trying to take control, who looked at her with respect as well as desire, Piper began to understand that perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps love, real love, wasn't about surrender or submission. Perhaps it was about partnership, about choosing to share your strength rather than having it diminished. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes," she said, taking his hand in hers. "This is unfamiliar territory for me." Thomas's fingers tightened around hers. "For both of us," he admitted, But I think we've both faced worse challenges." The truth of that made Piper smile. They had indeed faced worse gunfire, betrayal, loss. Surely learning to navigate a relationship couldn't be more difficult than rebuilding a home from ashes. "Then yes," she said, the words feeling both frightening and right. "I want you to stay." The joy that spread across Thomas's face made Piper's heart catch. He pulled her gently into his arms, and this time when they kissed, there was no hesitation, no holding back. It was a promise, a beginning, a declaration more powerful than words. When they finally parted, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Thomas kept his arms around her, and Piper found she had no desire to step away. "We should head back to the Millers," Thomas said, though he made no move to release her. "Early start tomorrow." Piper nodded but lingered in the circle of his embrace, savoring this moment of quiet certainty. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the continuing rebuilding, the approaching trial, the inevitable adjustments as they learned to build a life together without sacrificing their individual strengths. But for now, standing in the shadow of her half-built home with the man who had helped her rediscover the possibility of love, Piper Montgomery felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope, not just for survival, but for happiness. As they walked hand in hand toward the Miller's farm, Piper glanced back once at the framework silhouetted against the twilight sky. It was just the beginning of her new home, and of the journey she and Thomas were embarking on together. Love, she was beginning to understand, wasn't the lie she had believed it to be. It was a truth being written day by day, in actions rather than words, in presence rather than promises. And Thomas Blackwood, with his steady hands and quiet strength, was writing that truth in ways she could no longer deny or resist. For the first time in 4 years, Piper allowed herself to look toward the future not with determination alone, but with genuine joy. Whatever came next, they would face it together, two independent spirits who had chosen, freely and fully, to walk the same path. The rebuilding of Piper's cabin progressed rapidly over the following weeks. The community's efforts coordinated with the precision of a military campaign, thanks to Thomas's organizational skills. By the end of the month, the structure was complete, a sturdy 2-room cabin with a stone fireplace, solid walls, and windows that let in the spring sunshine. It was both familiar and new, like Piper herself. The layout echoed her childhood home, but Thomas had incorporated improvements: larger windows, a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides, clever storage solutions that maximized the limited space. The day they moved her few salvaged possessions and new furnishings into the completed cabin, the entire community gathered for a celebration. Tables were set up in the yard, laden with food contributed by neighboring farms. Children played tag between the barn and corral while their parents shared stories and laughter. Piper, watching from her new porch, felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. These people, her neighbors, her friends, had become something more, an extended family bound by shared hardship and mutual support. "Quite a community you have here," observed Sheriff Donovan, who had ridden out for the celebration. "Reminds me of the settlements back east before the war, people looking out for each other." "It's how the West will be settled properly," Piper replied. "Not by lone wolves or corporations, but by communities working together." The sheriff nodded approvingly. "Your father used to say something similar." He glanced toward Thomas, who was helping Harold Miller set up a makeshift dance floor. "Blackwood seems to be settling in well." Piper followed his gaze, a warmth spreading through her chest at the sight of Thomas. In the weeks since the confrontation with Holloway, he had become an integral part of the community, respected for his skills and steady nature. "He is," she agreed, unable to keep a certain softness from her voice. Sheriff Donovan smiled knowingly. "Good, he's needed roots for a long time." He tipped his hat to her. "Well, I should mingle. Wanted to let you know before I go, Holloway's trial is set for next month in Denver. With the evidence we've gathered and the witnesses willing to testify, he'll likely hang for your father's murder, among other crimes." The news sent a complex wave of emotions through Piper: relief, vindication, and a strange sort of closure. "Thank you, Sheriff, for everything." As the celebration continued into the evening, lanterns were lit and a local fiddler began playing, accompanied by a banjo and harmonica. Couples moved onto the improvised dance floor, their shadows stretching and merging in the golden light. Thomas found Piper watching from the sidelines, a cup of cider in her hands and a contemplative expression on her face. "A penny for your thoughts," he said, leaning against the porch railing beside her. Piper smiled. "I was just thinking about how much has changed in such a short time. A month ago, I was alone in my old cabin, expecting another confrontation with Holloway. Now he's awaiting trial, I have a new home, and—" She hesitated, still finding it difficult to articulate the most significant change. "And," Thomas prompted gently. Piper met his gaze. "And I'm not alone anymore." The simple statement encompassed so much: her growing relationship with Thomas, her strengthened bonds with the community, her gradual opening to possibilities she had long denied herself. Thomas's expression softened. He took the cup from her hands and set it aside, then extended his hand to her. "Dance with me," Piper hesitated. "I haven't danced in years," she admitted. "Not since before my father died." "Neither have I," Thomas replied, "but I think we can figure it out together." There was something symbolic in the invitation, a step into a shared future, an acknowledgement of their willingness to learn new patterns together. Piper placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her to the dance floor just as the fiddler began a waltz. Thomas's hand settled at her waist, warm and steady. "Just follow my lead," he murmured, guiding her into the rhythm of the music. To Piper's surprise, the steps came back to her easily, her body remembering what her mind had forgotten. Thomas moved with unexpected grace for a man of his size and background, guiding her through turns and steps with confident ease. "Where did you learn to dance like this?" Piper asked, genuinely curious. A hint of color touched Thomas's cheeks. "My mother insisted." Said no son of hers would grow up without knowing how to properly escort a lady at a social gathering. The image of a young Thomas reluctantly learning dance steps made Piper smile. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Thomas agreed, a flash of old grief crossing his features. "She died the year before the war began. I think perhaps it was a blessing she didn't have to see what the conflict did to our town, to our family." Piper understood that particular blessing all too well. "My mother missed the war too, and my father's murder." "What do you think she would make of all this?" Thomas asked, gesturing with a slight nod to encompass the celebration, the new cabin, and perhaps themselves. Piper considered the question seriously. "She would approve of the community coming together," she said slowly. "She always believed in the power of cooperation over conflict." A small smile touched her lips. "And she would like you, I think. She had no patience for pretense or empty flattery." "High praise," Thomas said, a warmth in his eyes that made Piper's heart beat faster. As they danced, Piper became aware of approving glances from their neighbors. News of their developing relationship had spread quickly in the small community, and the general consensus seemed to be one of satisfaction, as if a long-anticipated event had finally come to pass. "I think we're being watched," she murmured to Thomas. He chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly through his chest. "Small communities always keep a close eye on courtships. It's entertainment." "Is that what this is?" Piper asked, suddenly needing to name what was growing between them. "A courtship," Thomas's steps slowed slightly, his expression becoming more serious. "I would like it to be," he said quietly, "if that's what you want as well." The directness of his response was both terrifying and exhilarating. For so long, Piper had kept her heart carefully guarded, convinced that love was a luxury she couldn't afford, a risk too great to take. But over these past weeks, Thomas had demonstrated day by day, through actions rather than words, that not all men were like Charles, that love could be about support rather than possession. "Yes," she said, the word feeling like a step into unknown territory. "I think I would like that too." The smile that spread across Thomas's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual but transformative, lighting his features from within. He pulled her slightly closer as they continued to dance, their movements in perfect harmony with the music and with each other. As the evening progressed, Piper found herself relaxing into this new reality, being part of a pair, accepting support without sacrificing independence, allowing herself to care deeply for someone while maintaining her own strength. Later, after the guests had departed and they stood alone on the porch of her new home, Thomas took her hands in his. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "A housewarming gift." He produced a small wooden box carved with intricate patterns of leaves and vines. Piper took it, admiring the craftsmanship. "Did you make this?" she asked, running her fingers over the detailed carving. Thomas nodded. "I've been working on it in the evenings. Open it." Piper lifted the lid to reveal a delicate silver pendant nestled on a bed of soft cloth. It was shaped like a tiny book, with minuscule hinges that allowed it to open. Inside, she found a pressed wildflower, a mountain columbine, Colorado's state flower. "It's beautiful," she whispered, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I noticed you lost your mother's pendant in the fire," Thomas explained, his voice gentle. "I can't replace that, but I thought perhaps this might give you something new to carry with you." The consideration behind the gift, noticing her loss, understanding its significance, creating something that honored her love of books and the land, moved Piper deeply. It was exactly the sort of gift her father might have given her mother, personal and meaningful rather than merely decorative. "Will you help me put it on?" she asked, removing the pendant from its box. Thomas took the delicate silver chain and stepped behind her. Piper lifted her hair, feeling the whisper of his breath against her neck as he fastened the clasp. His fingers lingered at her nape for a moment, a touch so gentle it might have been imagination. When he stepped back around to face her, his expression was one of undisguised admiration. "It suits you," he said simply. Piper touched the pendant where it rested against her collarbone. "Thank you. Not just for this, but for everything." In the soft lantern light, Thomas's features seemed both stronger and more vulnerable than in daylight, the angles of his face more pronounced, the emotion in his eyes more visible. "Piper," he began, his voice taking on a quality she hadn't heard before. "I know it's only been a few weeks and I don't want to rush you, but I need you to know that my feelings for you are profound." The careful choice of words made Piper smile. He was deliberately avoiding declarations that might frighten her, respecting her caution about love and its trappings. "Your feelings are reciprocated," she replied, adopting his formal tone with gentle humor. Thomas's eyes crinkled at the corners, recognition of her teasing softening his serious expression. "Well, that's good to know." "It is, isn't it?" Piper agreed, stepping closer to him. "Very informative." A chuckle escaped him, breaking the tension. "I'm making a mess of this, aren't I?" "No," Piper said, her humor fading into sincerity. "You're being considerate of my fears, but Thomas." She took a deep breath, gathering courage for words she hadn't spoken in years. "I'm not afraid anymore, at least not of this, not of us." The admission hung between them, simple but profound. Thomas's gaze searched hers, seeking confirmation of what he'd heard. "Are you saying?" He began cautiously. "I'm saying that I love you," Piper interrupted, the words falling from her lips with surprising ease. "I didn't expect to. I didn't want to, but here we are." For a moment, Thomas seemed stunned into silence. Then a joy so pure it was almost painful to witness spread across his features. "Here we are indeed," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "And I love you, Piper Montgomery, with all that I am." He gathered her into his arms then, his kiss a perfect mixture of tenderness and passion, of restraint and abandon. Piper responded with equal fervor, years of denied emotion finally finding expression in this connection between them. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "It's late, and propriety suggests propriety can wait until tomorrow," Piper interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "Stay with me tonight, just to talk," she added quickly, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm not ready to sleep alone in this new house." Thomas studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "To talk," he agreed softly. They entered the cabin together, lighting a lamp that cast a warm glow over the newly furnished main room. Outside, the spring night was alive with the sounds of crickets and the distant call of an owl. Inside, the fresh scent of pine mingled with the earthy aroma of the banked fire in the hearth. They sat before the fireplace, Thomas adding another log to coax the embers back to flames. Side by side on the small sofa Thomas had helped build, they talked late into the night about their childhoods, their losses, their hopes for the future, about the trial to come and what justice for her father would mean, about the ranch and how it might grow with two pairs of hands tending it. Gradually, their conversation drifted into comfortable silences, punctuated by the occasional question or observation. Piper found herself leaning against Thomas's shoulder, his arm around her a shelter rather than a constraint. "Tell me about your mother's books," Thomas said during one such quiet moment. "The ones you lost in the fire." Piper closed her eyes, remembering. "Classics mostly, Shakespeare, Austen, the Brontes, some history and science. She was determined I would have an education, even out here where schools were scarce." "We could replace them," Thomas suggested. "Not the exact copies, I know, but the works themselves. Denver has several good bookshops." The thought warmed Piper, not just the suggestion itself, but the understanding behind it, the recognition of what those books had meant to her. "I'd like that," she said softly. Then, after a pause, "What about your father's furniture workshop? Do you ever think of returning to that trade?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently tracing patterns on her arm. "I've thought about it more recently," he admitted. "Especially while building your furniture. There's a piece in creating something with your hands that I'd forgotten." "You could set up a workshop here," Piper suggested. "There's plenty of good timber on the property." Thomas looked down at her, surprise and pleasure evident in his expression. "You wouldn't mind? I think it's an excellent idea. The community needs a skilled woodworker, and you clearly have the talent." She smiled up at him. "Besides, it would be good to have you working close to home instead of taking tracking jobs that keep you away for weeks." The implication that she was envisioning a shared future, a home together, hung unspoken between them. Thomas's arm tightened slightly around her. "I like the sound of that," he said quietly. They fell into another comfortable silence, the crackling fire and their shared warmth creating a cocoon of contentment around them. Outside, the moon traced its path across the star-filled sky. Inside, two people who had thought themselves destined for solitude discovered the joy of shared silence, of unspoken understanding, of walls carefully lowered to admit another heart. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both. Piper woke briefly in the early hours of the morning to find herself still on the sofa, her head pillowed on Thomas's chest, his arms protectively around her even in sleep. Instead of embarrassment or alarm, she felt only a profound sense of rightness, of having found her place in the world. Carefully, so as not to wake him, she adjusted her position slightly and closed her eyes once more, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. There would be challenges ahead: the trial, the rebuilding of her ranch, the inevitable adjustments as they learned to build a life together. But for the first time in years, Piper faced the future not with grim determination alone, but with hope, with joy, with love. The morning light, streaming through the new windows, found them still there, wrapped in each other's arms and the promise of a shared tomorrow. The weeks leading up to Holloway's trial passed in a blur of activity. Thomas officially moved into the cabin with Piper, an arrangement that raised a few eyebrows in town, but was accepted without comment by their neighbors, who recognized the deep bond that had formed between them. Together, they continued improving the property, repairing fences, expanding the garden, planning for future additions to the cabin as their needs grew. Thomas set up a small workshop in one of the outbuildings, using tools salvaged from town and techniques remembered from his father's training. His first major project was a bookcase for Piper, crafted from local pine with intricate carvings along the edges. As promised, they traveled to Denver together to purchase replacements for some of her mother's lost books, returning with volumes that began to fill the new shelves. Their journey to Denver also served another purpose: meetings with the prosecutor handling Holloway's case. Piper provided her testimony in detailed written form, describing her father's refusal to sell and the subsequent accident that had taken his life. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Hawkins, seemed confident in their case. "With the confession from Holloway's hired gun and the testimony about the attack on your property, we have more than enough to secure a conviction," he assured them. Justice will be served, Miss Montgomery. The trial itself was a 3-day ordeal that tested Piper's strength in ways she hadn't anticipated. Sitting in the crowded courtroom, listening to clinical descriptions of her father's murder, facing Holloway's cold glare across the space, it reopened wounds she had thought long scarred over. But Thomas was beside her throughout, his quiet support unwavering. When her voice faltered during her testimony, his steady gaze gave her the courage to continue. When Holloway's defense attorney tried to paint her as a hysterical woman imagining conspiracies, Thomas's hand found hers beneath the table, anchoring her against the tide of anger that threatened to overwhelm her composure. On the final day, as the jury delivered their verdict guilty on all counts, including the murder of James Montgomery, Piper felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had carried for 4 long years. Holloway's sentencing to hang for his crimes brought not joy, but a solemn sense of closure, of a chapter finally ending. "It's over," Thomas said quietly as they left the courthouse. "Your father can rest easy now," Piper nodded, blinking back tears that were part relief, part lingering grief. "I just wish he could have seen the valley now, the community coming together, the water resources protected for everyone's use." "He did see it," Thomas replied, surprising her. "Through you. You made his vision reality, Piper." The simple truth of this statement settled deep within her heart, a balm to the ache of loss that had never fully disappeared. Her father's dreams lived on through her actions, through the choices she had made to protect the land and serve the community. Their return to Willow Creek after the trial marked the beginning of a new chapter. With Holloway's threat removed and justice served, Piper found herself able to look forward rather than constantly watching her back. The ranch flourished under their combined care, and Thomas's furniture business began to attract customers from neighboring settlements, his reputation for quality workmanship spreading by word of mouth. As summer bloomed across the valley, painting the meadows with wildflowers and filling the creek with crystal-clear snowmelt, Piper and Thomas settled into a partnership that defied conventional roles. He never questioned her authority on ranch matters, recognizing her years of experience and deep connection to the land. She, in turn, respected his expertise in security and construction, creating a balance of shared decision-making that utilized both their strengths. One evening in late June, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of pink and gold, Thomas reached for Piper's hand, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. "I've been thinking," he began, then hesitated, seeming to search for the right words. "A dangerous pastime," Piper teased gently, curious about his unusual uncertainty. Thomas smiled, some of his tension easing. "Indeed." He took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about us, about our future together." Piper's heart quickened, though she kept her expression calm. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That I want to make it official." He turned to face her fully. "Piper Montgomery, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had begun to suspect the direction of his thoughts, the actual proposal still caught Piper by surprise. For a moment, old fears surfaced, memories of Charles's false promises, of the independence she had fought so hard to maintain. But Thomas was nothing like Charles, and marriage to him would not mean surrendering her identity or her strength. Over the past months, he had demonstrated day by day that his love was not about possession but partnership, not about control but support. "Yes," she said, the word emerging with surprising ease. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Blackwood." The joy that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual but transformative, illuminating his features from within. From his pocket, he produced a ring, a simple band of silver set with a small but perfect sapphire that caught the fading light. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "My father made it for her when they were young." The ring fit as if it had been crafted for her hand, the sapphire's deep blue reminiscent of Thomas's eyes. Piper admired it for a moment, then leaned forward to seal their engagement with a kiss that conveyed all the emotion words couldn't capture. When they parted, Thomas kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I promise you this," he said softly. I will spend every day making our love a truth you can believe in, not a lie to be feared. The promise, simple and profound, resonated with all Piper had come to understand about love since Thomas had entered her life. Love wasn't the pretty lie she had once believed it to be, a trap disguised as freedom, a cage masked with flowers. Real love, the kind Thomas offered and she returned, was foundation and framework, shelter and strength, truth revealed through daily action rather than empty words. Their wedding, held on a perfect autumn day with the aspen trees turning gold along the mountainsides, was a community celebration. The small church in Willow Creek overflowed with neighbors and friends who had supported them through fire and rebuilding, through danger and triumph. Piper wore a dress of simple cream silk ordered from Denver, with her mother's restored locket, recovered from the ashes of her old cabin, around her neck and wildflowers in her hair. Thomas, standing tall and proud at the altar, watched her approach with an expression of such undisguised love that it brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic ranchers in attendance. Their vows, written together in the quiet evenings of late summer, spoke not of ownership or obedience but of partnership and respect, of promises to support each other's strengths rather than exploit each other's weaknesses. "I take you as my equal," Thomas promised, his voice steady and sure. "To stand beside you in joy and in sorrow, to honor your independence even as we build our connection, to love you completely while respecting you fully." "I choose you freely," Piper responded, her heart in every word. "To share my strength without diminishing it, to offer my trust without surrendering my voice, to love you with all that I am while becoming more through our union." As they exchanged rings, Thomas's a match to the silver band he had given her. Crafted by his own hands, Piper felt the final walls around her heart dissolve, not in surrender but in conscious choice, in the recognition that true love expanded rather than confined. The celebration afterward, held at their ranch under a canopy of autumn leaves and twinkling lanterns, lasted well into the night. Music and laughter filled the air as neighbors danced, shared stories, and offered heartfelt toasts to the couple who had, in their own way, helped strengthen the entire community. Later, as the guests departed and they stood alone on their porch, looking out over the land that had brought them together, Thomas pulled Piper close. "Happy?" he asked simply. Piper considered the question seriously. Happiness had seemed like a luxury for so long, a state reserved for others while she focused on survival and independence. But now, looking at the home they had built together, feeling the steady strength of Thomas's arms around her, she recognized that happiness wasn't something that happened to you, it was something you created, day by day, choice by choice. "Yes," she answered, the word carrying the weight of all she had learned about love and trust since that spring day when a stranger had ridden to her defense. "Happier than I ever thought possible." Thomas's smile, that particular smile he reserved only for her, warmed her more thoroughly than the autumn sun. "Then my most important work is done," he said softly, "though I intend to continue it every day." In the years that followed, he kept that promise. Through the expansion of their ranch, the addition of a larger workshop for Thomas's growing furniture business, the birth of their first child, a daughter with her father's blue eyes, and her mother's determined spirit, Thomas Blackwood demonstrated daily that love was not the lie Piper had once believed it to be, but a truth revealed through consistent action and unwavering commitment. And Piper, who had once armored her heart against all possibility of connection, discovered that the greatest strength wasn't in standing alone, but in choosing to stand beside someone who valued your independence even as they shared your journey. Together, they built not just a home or a business, but a legacy that honored James Montgomery's vision, a community where water resources were shared fairly, where neighbors supported each other through hardship and celebrated each other's triumphs, where love was not a pretty word but a daily truth, proven through actions rather than promised through empty declarations. As their family grew to include a son who inherited his grandfather's gift for woodworking and a second daughter whose love of books rivaled her grandmother's, Piper often thought back to that spring day when gunshots had shattered her window and a stranger had ridden into her yard, changing the course of her life forever. She had believed then that love was only a lie, a pretty trap designed to take away her hard-won independence. Thomas had not tried to convince her otherwise with words, knowing they would fall on deaf ears after her experiences with betrayal. Instead, he had shown her, day by day, action by action, that real love was built on respect and partnership, on supporting strength rather than exploiting weakness. In doing so, he had not just won her heart, but transformed her understanding of what love could be: not a cage, but wings; not a constraint, but freedom shared; not a pretty lie, but the most profound truth of all. And in the quiet moments, watching their children play in the meadow where she had once stood alone against threats and loss, Piper recognized that her greatest strength had never been in the walls she built around her heart, but in the courage it took to let them fall for the right person, for the man who had spent every day making truth out of what she had believed was only a lie.